Greetings and welcome. My name is Aaron Craig with Beyond Us Games, and this is part 1 of the awesome inventory system. Now, if you'd like to follow along in exactly what I'm doing here, I have this project that is starting from scratch, but all of the sprites and the player object have been created for you. It's available in the description down below for you to download for GameMaker Studio 2, and you can follow along with me there if you so desire. But with that, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do is make an object. And we're going to name this obj inventory. And this object is going to manage our inventory system apart from the player. So it'll be separate. And that way, if anything goes wrong, if we have any bugs, we know where to look. And this object is going to be persistent from room to room, so it will always be there. Now, to make sure that is the case, we need to click on persistent, which is right here. GameMaker Studio 1, it's the same kind of box, says persistent. Just make sure that is checked. And then while we are thinking about it, let's put it inside of our room. Doesn't matter where. I would put it inside, like in the top left corner or something like that. That way it's in your room. So with that, let's go ahead and put a create event inside of here. And we are going to set up a few variables. And these variables are actually going to be global variables. And we initialize that with the term global var. And that allows us to access these variables from anywhere without having to use an accessor saying like obj_player.inventory or something like that. So we can name these whatever we want. I'm going to name them player inventory and player inventory width. And I'm going to set up player inventory width equal to 5. And the reason I'm doing that is we are going to be using the width of this inventory system in several different places, and I want to be able to access that very easily. And if we use a variable like this, then all we have to do is come in here and change this number if we ever change the design of our inventory, instead of going around and finding every single 5 that relates to the width and then changing that in there. So this just makes it a lot easier in the long run, which is what I'm trying to design for, is a very flexible and dynamic inventory system that you can use in lots of different cases. Now, player inventory, we're going to use a function called dsGridCreate. And this is actually going to be our primary inventory, and the dsGrid system is what we're going to be using all of those built-in functions to manage it. So I'm going to middle click on this and I'm going to bring up the help menu because it is very helpful to understand what we're using. Now, DS stands for data structure, and that just means it is a way of holding data in a particular format that is kind of industry standard, so that we know the things that a grid can do. We know the things that a map can do, which is another type of DS. There are built-in functions, and if we go back to DS grids right here, you can see that all of these functions are related to DS grids. And so these are the functions that we are going to be using, things like dsGridSet and dsGridGet. We can actually access them through the normal array accessor, but we want to use these functions because we know what we're going to get and we know how they're going to work. So with that, let's talk about dsGrids and why we want to use them in the first place. So they are a 2D array that can be any size and obviously have a lot of functionality built in, but they can store any kind of data you throw at them. They can store sprites, strings, numbers, scripts, all of these things that we are going to want to be associated with each item in our inventory. This grid can hold, and we can sort through this array and find things that we need to through a couple of for loops that once we write once, we are good to go because we'll add them as a script and we can call them and add functionality that we want to our own inventory system. Now, I want to show you the inventory that we are going to be using throughout this series. It's going to look like this. So the orange numbers are computer counting, which is how we're going to access them, and the black numbers are for normal counting, but also how some of the functions, the dsGrid functions, actually return numbers, such as the height and the width. They return a height of 2, which is important to know because if we are counting computer style, we need to realize that a height of 2 is actually a height of 1 in the way that we need to know about it. Now, our items are going to have just 5 things of information about them. They're going to have a name, amount, description, sprite, and script. And they're going to be in this order, which is important because we are going to access things like the name and the amount when we need to sort through them, when we need to find a specific item. The name is going to be in the 0 slot. So when we reference the X position of 0, we know that that item is going to be the name of that item. And when we reference the 4th spot of the X axis, we are calling that script to be used. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and create our inventory. And it's actually very simple because we just need to give it a width and a height. And we already have a width, which we have predefined here, and a height of 1 because we want it to have a height, but there's no actual items inside of it. So again, this is counting from 1. So this is just going to be one item of 1 height inside of our DS grid. There's nothing in it now, but we are going to put something in it, and then I'm going to show you that this is actually working. Now, to add items, we need to create our own script. Because we are going to add it, like I showed you, in the way and in that specific format for our items. So we're going to call this add item, and this is actually going to be a very generalized script in the sense that you are going to be able to use this anytime throughout your games. When you want to add an item from the end of a fight, all you have to do is grab the item that it is and call this script, pass in the right information, and it will add an item to the inventory. If you are buying an item from a merchant, if you pick up an item from a ground, this script will be functional for all of those cases, which is very useful. Now, I'm going to copy and paste something in here, which you may have seen, you may not have seen. This is JSON comments, and it allows our custom-made functions, our scripts, to behave and look a little more like GameMaker Studio functions. With these in here, I've added the function name, a description, and also the arguments that we are going to be passing in. So if I come up here and I actually type in add item, it changes color because I have changed the predefined color for my scripts. That way I can see them easier. But then you can also look right down here that it now tells me, like a GameMaker Studio built-in function, what I need to add in. I need to pass in a DS grid, and it's going to be called grid. The grid to add is what I need to put in there, which is going to be player inventory. So I need to pass in a string and an item name, and so on and so forth. Every time that you add this set of scripts, or set of comments, you can make a script look a lot more like a function. And you can find that in the help manual, which is where I found it. So what we're going to do is we're going to set these up. We're going to say grid to add to equals argument 0. We're going to say new item name equals argument 1. New item amount equals argument 2. New item description equals argument 3. New item sprite equals argument 4. And then new item script equals argument 5. Okay, now we need to think about a couple of cases here. So when we are designing a script, we need it to work under any circumstances. And for adding an item, we need to think about 2 cases. So case 1, item is already in the inventory. And then case 2, it's not in the inventory. So for case 1, depending on how you want to handle it, we are going to handle it as if we already have the item in the inventory, we are going to increase the amount that it is, because you can hold as many items as you want here. Now, of course, you can add in like a weight category, and then you can have all sorts of different information about your inventory if you want specifically. But in our case, we're just going to say, if we have an item already, just increase the amount. If not, then we are going to add the item to the inventory. So to increase the amount, what we need to do is have a special case. So we are going to check to see if that is already in there. We're going to check through a for loop. And we are going to be using for loops a lot throughout this series. So if you don't know how to use them, I suggest you figure that out. I have a couple of videos on them, GameMaker language and so forth. But if not, I'm going to try to explain them here as best I can. A for loop well, actually, let me show you a little thing. You can actually, what is that? I just found this. F4, and if you click 4, you have a predefined for loop that it sets up for you. Now, these words are kind of big, but basically, you need to initialize a variable that is going to be changed every time the loop is run. So I'm going to say I equals 0. So it's just a variable called I that I'm setting up right now, and it is going to start at 0. And it's starting at 0 because our inventory starts counting at 0. The condition is while I is less than ds grid height grid to add to. So while it is less than the height of our grid to add to, and while it is less, it is going to then go through this entire statement here. All of the code inside of these brackets will then be run while this is less than that. When it comes to the end of this statement, it is then going to increment it. And we are going to say plus plus I, which just means I equals I plus 1. It's the exact same thing. It's just that plus plus I is a shorthand for it, and it's the way that I learned to code, so maybe it's the way you learn to code. So our statement here is going to look like this. We're going to say if ds grid get grid to add to, you have to pass in the ID of the grid on all of these functions you want to use so it knows which information to grab. So if we're going to grab the information on 0, which is the name, and I, which is the item slot, because we're going to go through our inventory and look at every single item. And if the information returned from this function, which can either be a real or a string, if it is returned and it equals new item name, then what we want to do is just increase the amount that item is there because it's already there. So if this returns true, it means that we found the item in the inventory. So then we're going to say ds grid set grid to add to, and this is going to be 1. So we're going to set the value of 1 and I, so the spot we're at, but the amount value we're going to change, and the amount we're going to change it is by the new item amount right here. But we have to get that value beforehand because we can't just assume that they only have 1, because sometimes if it's like gold, they could have a lot more. And if they picked up 5 gold, we need to add 5 to however much they had before. And to do that, we use their function called dsGridGet. So we get the amount they already have and then add our new amount to that. So grid to add to, and it is going to be 1 and I for exactly where we are. It's going to be plus new item amount. And then we are going to return true. And this is just for if anything goes wrong, we can set up a return false, and then we'll know that something failed along the way. So that is the case if we find anything. So if we find the item, we're just going to increase the amount and we'll call it good. We don't need to do anything else. But most of the time, we're not going to find it, and we actually are going to want to do this second case. And it will look like this. So let me bring this up. So if dsGridGet grid to add to 0 and 0, we're going to say if it doesn't equal 0. So this is simply a check. And this check is saying that if the grid is empty, then we don't need to do this. But if the grid isn't empty, if the first slot in the inventory it has an item already, then we are going to increase the size of the grid. But if the first item in the inventory is 0, which zeros would mean that there's nothing in it, which right now there is nothing in it. When we create a grid, it fills all of those slots up with zeros, which is how we know that there's nothing in there. So there is 5 zeros right now in our DS grid. So we are checking to see if the grid, if our inventory is completely empty, and the way we know that is through zeros. So we're checking to see if it doesn't equal to 0, because if it does, we can just put an item in that slot. Does that make sense? I'm hoping that this makes sense. If our inventory is not empty, what we're going to do is dsGrid resize. We are going to increase the size of our grid by 1, grid to add to, and the width is player inventory width, and the new height is actually going to be dsGrid height grid to add to plus 1. So if our grid is empty, that means that the name of the first item will be 0. And if that's the case, we are then just going to add in the next set here. But if it's not empty, if there's already an item there, then we want to increase the grid size. This is a safety check because when I was making this, I found that if you just resize the grid every single time, because we're starting the grid at 1 size, it does a funny thing. So just make sure you have this in here. Now what we want to do is say new item spot equals dsGrid height. And this is going to be grid to add to, as usual. But now it's going to be -1, because we want the spot that is below what it actually returns. Because remember, the dsGrid height will return a size of 2, and if we're counting in computer, which is how we're going to assign it, 0, 1, 2 is actually the third spot. So we need to subtract 1 from whatever this returns in this circumstance. And so now what we're going to do is just use the function dsGrid set and set all of the values in our new blank inventory spot to the values that we have passed in. So it's going to look like this. We're going to say grid to add to, 0, new item spot. That's why we did that, so that we don't have to put this function in there every single time. And new item name. So what am I going to do right here is actually copy this and paste it. Now, be careful, because we need to change these numbers right here to 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we need to change what we're putting in there as well. So this needs to be new item amount, new item description, new item sprite, and new item script. But with that actually lets us add all of the values that we are passing in into the correct spots. And we have to do that a lot, but now it is a script. It's a function that we can call very easily, very quickly, and it will just work every single time. So even though we had to kind of copy and paste this code a lot, we just had to do it once. That's it. So now we have a working script to add items to actually any inventory, any grid we can actually add items to, and it will do it perfectly because we have set it up that way. Now, to show you this, we're going to make obj pickup, and we're going to do this so that I can show you in kind of a graphical, visual way so that you can actually see it working. So we're going to not give it a sprite because we're going to assign it a sprite, and the way we're going to do that is come into our create event. So set up default values, and now inside of here we're actually going to say my item name is equal to undefined, my item amount equals undefined, my item description equals undefined, and my item sprite undefined, my item script undefined. So what we're going to do is when we create these items inside of wherever, we are going to set all of these values so that they can be dynamically created at will instead of having a set of items for all of them. Right now, I just have these sprites, but in a big game, you'd probably have way more items than this. Using just one item and through this method, you can have all of the items in your game as pickup objects with just one object right here. And the way that you can do that is by adding the draw event. And inside of draw, we're going to assign sprite index equal to my item sprite. We're going to draw self, which is very important, otherwise it will not appear. And then we are going to add a collision event with our player. And inside of here, we are going to call the function add item. And we want to pass in the player inventory, and then the item name is my item name, my item amount, and you can kind of see where we're going from here. We're just going to pass in those values that we just set up. My item description, my item sprite, and my item script. And then we're going to call instance destroy on ourselves, because as soon as we pick up that item, we no longer want to have that item in the room. So inside of here, we're going to pass in 3 items, and it doesn't really matter what, but if we double click on it and click on creation code, we can then set this up. So to make sure that we got this all correct, I'm going to copy this section into here, and inside of our creation code, I'm just going to copy and paste that, and then I'm going to set these for whatever we want. So this is going to be a red berry. My item amount will be 1. Description will be a delicious red berry. My item sprite is SPR red berry. And item script right now is just going to be nothing, because we don't have anything to give it a script. Eventually, if this was a healing item, we might have a healing script. We can pass in how much it would heal, and so on and so forth. But right now, we don't. So let me just go ahead and paste that one more time. Give it another name. We'll call this one sword. My item amount of 1. Description is a metal sword. Duh. My item sprite is SPR sword. And item script, again, will be blank. And then I'm not going to set this third one so that you can kind of see exactly what happens. Now, if we run this, 2 of those items will show up. The third one is going to be like that, because the very first sprite in here is actually my SPR Bard walk up. And it picks up undefined kind of as a, well, when it assigns sprite index inside of the object pickup, it does it with the very first one that comes into contact with. And so it looks kind of funny, but if you ever see like the very first sprite show up in your inventory somewhere, that's what's happening, is it is pulling the very first value of your sprite. But now if I collect this, well, nothing happens. It doesn't look like anything happens, but it does. So I'm going to press F6 to open up the debugger, and I am going to set global variables to true. I'm going to pull this up, and I am going to right-click after I pause. I'm going to right-click on this player inventory and set it to DS grid. And now, right here, you can see that it has a width of 5 and a height of 1. Now, if we play this, and I move around and I pick up a berry, it's going to then add that berry and keep the height of 1 because the was empty the first time. And if I come over here and pick up a sword, it is now a height of 2, red berry, and a sword. So that is a fully working inventory to be able to add items to it. What happens if we do that? We pick up an undefined item. So that's kind of funny. But that is our inventory system, at least the very basics of it. So creating an inventory is actually super simple. If you're using DS grids, most of the functions are already there. They are created for you, and all you have to do is utilize them. You can see it here in the debugger. With just that one script that we made, we can add items to our inventory in the correct amount and where they should go. Now, there's more functionality that we are going to do and add, and the biggest functionality is actually displaying the items. That is what most of this series is going to be about, is displaying our inventory in a way that looks good, is functional, and allows us to access the information that is being shown on screen. So that is what we are going to be working on the next couple of parts. I hope you will join me. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Hit me up on Twitter. Share this if you liked it. If it was useful, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. But as always, thank you very much for joining me. Have fun making great games, and I will talk to you later. If you find the content on my channel useful and you like it, consider supporting me on Patreon. All of the people on the screen are doing so, and they are awesome, and they get rewards, and you can join them. So thank you for your time, and have a wonderful day.